So this week we're going to look at the importance of water and water pollution and how climate change plays into this entire dynamic. Obviously, about 80% of the human body is made up of water, and it's a crucial element for us for life. It's also a crucial element of our food and materials that we use for industrial processing, as well as pretty much everything that we do. Approximately 75% of the Earth's surface is also covered with water, but of that, only about 3% is freshwater. And only 1% of the fresh water is actually available for human consumption. When we look at much of this water, it contains chemicals, there's different types of pollutants, bacteria, garbage, waste, lots of different things in the water that may make it something that we can no longer consume. And we can really distinguish between water quality and quantity problems as we start to look at the global picture for water. And on average, right now, we have sufficient water to meet human needs, but one of the big challenges is water distribution, and with our ever-burgeoning population, another challenge we're having is how are we going to make sure that we have access to clean, potable water for everyone. When we actually look at water pollution, which is going to be one of the main focuses of this lecture, water pollution can be designated as any physical or chemical change in water that adversely affects the health of humans and other organisms. And obviously with the degree of water pollution is going to vary in magnitude by location. When we look at major water pollution issues globally, a lot of times it's really lack of disease-free water that is a challenge for populations. And in the States here, we have a lot of vaccinations for things like polio and things like that that used to be an illness that we would get from drinking polluted water, which would have major issues from a physical perspective and cause physical deformities. So anyways, when we look at water pollution overall, there's really 8 categories that we can consider. We can consider sewage, disease-causing agents, which are also often contained in sewage, sediment pollution, so that's the cloudiness of the water, the ability of water to penetrate the water column, inorganic plant and algal nutrients, so a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus and other components that plants and algae need to survive. Organic compounds, inorganic chemicals, radioactive substances, and thermal pollution. And thermal pollution is one that we won't talk a lot about today, but we have talked about previously when we were looking at the ocean conveyor belt and talking about changes in global temperatures. Also, thermal pollution can lead to things like loss of coral due to changes in temperatures. So this is a nice figure that shows major water pollutants and their sources. Some of the major infectious agents can be grouped into different categories, but the major infectious agents are typically bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and parasites. We didn't put in here prions and other infectious proteins because they're another whole class to themselves. And typically we find these organisms in human and animal waste. There's also oxygen demanding waste. So typically those would be waste that have what we call a high BOD, a high biological oxygen demand. And that's where typically we've got biodegradation of plant or animal products. And so when the organisms that are breaking it down respire, they consume oxygen and produce CO2, leading to an anaerobic condition, which can have negative consequences on the water column, especially since that can cause dead zones where you have fish unable to survive and those types of things. And we call that eutrophication. So the main sources of pollutants that can lead to eutrophication are things such as sewage, animal feedlots, food processing facilities, paper mills, and runoff from agricultural fields. We also have plant nutrients specifically, which can also contribute to eutrophication, and that's where we've actually got the nitrates and the phosphates coming in. And again, that can be from sewage, animal waste, inorganic fertilizers that run off of agricultural fields, as well as other potential sources. We can also have organic or inorganic chemicals, which can come from industry, farms, households, mining sites, as well as runoff from streets and parking lots. There's also sediments, which can again affect the water column and the ability for light to penetrate. So that can be soil, silts, clays, different components in the water column that actually limit that light penetration, and we would call that high turbidity. There's also heavy metals. Heavy metals have really negative effects on different organisms. So for example, lead, mercury, arsenic, not very great for any type of mammals, especially humans. And often we see these heavy metals being contributed to the water column from landfills, different chemicals, mining, or industrial discharges. And then there's also the thermal type of pollutant that we have discussed already a little bit, and that can come from climate change, but it could also come from electric power, industrial plants, cooling towers, all of those types of factors. So when we look at water quality, some of the major global trends that we're seeing is that contaminants are being detected regularly in water supplies everywhere. There's a really interesting study where they actually looked at contaminants in glacial melt in really remote regions, and they even found in those areas PCBs and other types of chemicals that through rainfall have been deposited into these areas. So really wherever we look, there's the potential for different types of water pollution on Earth. It doesn't matter where you are. There's also many regulators that are now requiring routine testing of chemicals that were virtually unknown for years. So I did some work for a while there on PPCPs and EDCs. So PPCPs are pharmaceutical and personal care products, and EDCs are endocrine disrupting chemicals. When I was doing research on both of these, what we were actually noticing is that a lot of the different medicines, drugs, hormonal agents, things like that that people take end up going through their system, getting peed out, and then flushed eventually into waterways. And we also see, It's HPV being really prevalent in the oceans to the point where sea turtles often get HPV tumors all over their bodies. And there's actually like quite a few deaths caused by this. And it's all coming into the water column from human waste pollution. And so as regulators are looking at all of these components, they're trying to figure out ways and methods to disinfect water and to ensure that the water that people are consuming is clean, but also to make sure that the wastewater is being treated effectively before it returns to waterways. And as the water supplies continue to tighten and our global population continues to increase, we need to make sure that we're removing any of these chemicals, agents, nutrients, any of these pollutants from the water, both before being consumed and also after the waste has been produced. So ensuring that we have efficient wastewater treatment as well. Now we do have the technologies to be able to purify all water and make it absolutely perfect, but one of the big challenges is that we need to be able to get certain nutrients and minerals in our water, but also it's expensive to completely purify water. If we did reverse osmosis for absolutely everything ever, we would remove anything except for basically water molecules and maybe some fine mineral components. And that's great. Everybody would be drinking absolutely perfect water. But it's incredibly expensive. It takes a fair amount of energy, which adds to the cost as well for the purification process. And the filters get used up on a relatively short time scale as well. So again, if we look at methods of disinfecting water, there's really 5 main methods. Chlorine is one of the most common, and we know that if you live in an urban area, typically your water is chlorinated at some point. The cities then try to remove that chlorine as much as they can before it comes out of your tap. But a lot of us still use post-source filters such as Britas and things like that to purify our water even further. So with chlorine, there are different ways of disinfection. If you're working within a water treatment facility, you're using different types of chlorine treatments. You can also use chlorine gas treatment. You can use sodium hypochlorite, like bleach, in your home to disinfect things. And then you can also use chlorine dioxide as a disinfectant. Another effective method for cleaning water is ozonation. For years, that's what the Dasani Water Company did. So Dasani is a subsidiary of Coca-Cola, and their water for years they touted as like, look at how clean and perfect it is, it's been ozonated. But a lot of people notice that they can taste a different taste to ozonated water, and so they actually stopped publicizing that that was one of the mechanisms by which they clean their water. One of the next steps that people can use is membrane filtration. So depending on the porosity of your membranes, you can actually get fairly high quality membranes that can screen out different types of bacteria, protozoa, and different agents. But membrane filtration is not always very effective for viruses and really small viruses. And so one of the smallest viruses out there that actually can have major effects on human health is the tuberculosis virus. So in areas where tuberculosis is common, it's really important to make sure that you're getting highly disinfected water. So then one of the next stages that people often couple with other types of disinfection is UV disinfection. So you use UV light to bombard the water that is traveling through a path. It then kills off any bacteria and also can kill viruses, thereby disinfecting your water. And again, the most effective type of water treatment is actually reverse osmosis. So when we look at some of the microorganisms that we've been discussing, bacteria are obviously one of the main considerations when it comes to illnesses caused by contaminated drinking water. Most people have heard of cholera. Cholera is caused by Vibrio cholerae, and most folks have also heard of E. coli. E. coli, especially if you have the 0571, I believe, is the type of E. coli that is incredibly toxic to humans, causes major gastrointestinal upset, and can lead to death. It's the one that you often see in outbreaks, whether it's lettuce or water outbreaks or other things like that. That is the main agent that is now screened for in Ontario because of the Walkerton water crisis. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit later. Other microorganisms obviously are viruses. So you've got Hep A, polio, tuberculosis, like I mentioned. And then we also have protozoa. So protozoa that you may have heard of are things like Giardia, which is also known as beaver fever, or Cryptosporidium, which a lot of people just call crypto, and again is another agent that often can cause severe intestinal upset. We see crypto more commonly in dogs and other types of animals who drink water that isn't as disinfected. So let's talk a little bit about these processes of disinfection. So the addition of a chlorine disinfectant to drinking water is very effective in killing or inactivating microorganisms. Chlorine has been known for years to be a powerful disinfectant, and the one challenge we find is that it actually does not kill all harmful microorganisms, so sometimes you need further treatment beyond simple chlorination. If we look at the relative effectiveness of chlorine, it's really effective on bacteria, and it's less effective on viruses and even less effective on protozoa. So when we're thinking about ways to clean your water, clean your house, all of these different types of components, sometimes chlorine or bleach are not necessarily the best types of agents to do the disinfection if you're dealing with viruses or protozoa. Ozonation is the next step in the process that can be very effective. It's used in more than 1,000 water treatment plants in European countries, but it hasn't been very popular in the US or Canada. Recently, there's been increased interest due to the discovery of chlorination disinfection. And so when you couple chlorination disinfection with ozonation, you end up with fairly effective treatment of the water column. The main process of ozonation is one where we actually insert gases into the water column, and that gas is ozone, so that's O3. And when it's bubbled into the water column, then ozone, which is highly reactive, reacts itself with any of the OH in the water molecules and this highly reactive, unstable type of component that we see will actually kill off different microorganisms. There are quite a few advantages to ozonation, but there's also quite a few disadvantages. And the disadvantages are that it tends to be expensive, it does have a high level of toxicity, it is relatively unstable, and you have to produce that ozone on site. It's also highly sensitive to inorganic and organic loads within your water. So if you haven't pre-screened and removed a lot of the sediment, then you're going to have a lot of different interactions with your ozone. It's also highly complicated from a maintenance and operations perspective, but one of the good things is that there's actually no lasting residues. So there are advantages and disadvantages to the technology, and a lot of it again comes down to costs. Another one that can be quite pricey is UV disinfection. So UV disinfection is basically 1/5 the cost of ozonation, so it's a lot cheaper than ozonation, but it's still significantly more expensive than chlorination. UV is also 1/10 the cost of membranes, so for filtration or for reverse osmosis. And because it's a cheaper technology, it's been adopted in a lot more areas. And I've actually worked with some companies in the Ottawa area that are part of what we'd call the clean tech industry, who are working to always advance their the effectiveness of their UV water treatment system that they use all over the world. So UV disinfects by basically the ultraviolet lights penetrate into the cell wall of microorganisms, and when it does so, it damages the DNA of the microorganisms, thereby causing damage to them overall, damage to their DNA, and inhibits their ability to reproduce. So you may end up consuming a little bit of dead microorganisms, but they're going to be in an inactive form and be unable to infect you. Because of the effectiveness and relative cheapness of UV disinfection, you can actually put it into some wastewater treatment plants as well as water treatment plants. And so in the wastewater treatment plants, we would actually see it coming right near the end of the treatment process before you have discharge. We also have environmental contaminants that can be affected by UV radiation, and so you can have some interactive components. But if we also combine UV and hydrogen peroxide, it's also really effective at destroying organic contaminants in the water column. So using our chemistry knowledge, we're able to actually effectively support overall water disinfection through fairly simple processes. So as I mentioned, UV is a growing area for drinking water, but also for wastewater. It also has been used more recently for groundwater remediation, where unwanted chemicals have entered into the water supply. It's a way in which you can actually destroy some of those chemicals and alleviate the effects that they would have on the humans who may consume them. And then there's also what we call indirect and direct potable reuse, and that's where wastewater is treated to turn into drinking water. I know that sounds not like the prettiest picture, but in areas where you're super water limited, it's really important to effectively recycle as much of that water as you can. And so UV oxidation is one of the most effective ways to do that from a cheaper cost perspective. Still, the best way to do it is through reverse osmosis. We also have something called UV photolysis. UV photolysis is where the UV light actually gets absorbed by a contaminant molecule, and then this absorption leads to the overall destruction of the chemical bonds of the contaminant, and by breaking it down, then these contaminants are not as toxic to humans. So here's a little bit of a chemical symbol that shows a little bit about how this works, and essentially what you're doing is you're creating radicals off these chemicals that then bind with oxygen in the water column and form products that are not reactive in the human body. You can also do the UV oxidation piece where you use the hydrogen peroxide and the UV in collaboration, and it does something very similar. You're breaking off different hydrogen bonds typically, or hydroxyl radicals from chemicals, and in doing so, those can eventually bind with the OH or the H molecules in water and create a stable molecule which is safe for us to consume. Here's the chemical reaction process for that, in case you're really interested. But basically you can see that the hydrogen peroxide, in the presence of UV radiation, produces 2 hydroxyl ions. And when you couple that with carbon in the water column, it basically captures radical species when you put in the presence of oxygen to produce products that are inert. So we talked a few minutes ago a little bit about areas where they actually have to make potable water from wastewater. One of the ways that we actually do that effectively is through advanced treatment of water with different technologies. So you may use microfiltration, you may use reverse osmosis, or you may use UV oxidation, or you may use all of them in combination, which would be my preference if I had to drink my wastewater. But thinking about all these different technologies, you can start to make some assessments on which would be best under different situations. Alright, so I'm going to pause a little bit on the water treatment piece from a drinking water perspective, and now we're going to talk about water treatment in wastewater and what happens when we don't treat it effectively. So with wastewater, when we allow exogenous nutrients or products that have a high biological oxygen demand into waterways, then we start to get this process of eutrophication occurring. So typically what happens in lakes or areas that have relatively low water flow, even in settling ponds and things like that, you have high levels of contamination of different nutrients in the water, and when algae interact with those nutrients, you start to get these algae blooms that occur. These algae blooms then cover the area. As the algae dies, it sinks in the water column, and it has a high biological oxygen demand. It uses a fair amount of oxygen to decompose, and in doing so leads to what we would call eutrophication, or dead zones within that lake or area. So here, one of the things that you can see in this image is that we've got a relatively slow-flowing system. It could be a stream, an estuary, a lake, a settling pond, any of those types of things. And you've got the exogenous nutrients, which allows algae to grow. When algae grows, it limits light penetration in the water column. You end up with low levels of dissolved oxygen. You end up with high algal growth, and consequently, you eutrophy your system. Here's an idea about a wastewater treatment plant or a sewage treatment spill, any type of point source that has a high level of biological oxygen demand. So one of the areas that we're actually seeing a really high level of biological oxygen demand are the water that is coming off of breweries and microbreweries. So if that's flushed directly into a river, then what ends up happening is the yeast and yeast residues that are being discharged want to consume oxygen as they decompose, and when they do so, they remove the oxygen from the water column that typically the fish would use to survive. So in this graph, what you can see is you have components that have a high level of biological oxygen demand. It uses oxygen. As it does, it pulls down the oxygen level in the water column. As that concentration of oxygen in the water column decreases, you end up with fish kills. And then when you have fish kills, that leads to more decomposing animals, and those decomposing animals use up even more oxygen in the water column, and it's again a positive feedback type of a cycle, which is not easy to break. So as I just mentioned, when nitrogen and phosphorus enter into the water column, you can end up with these large algal blooms, and a lot of times this nitrogen or phosphorus comes from human and animal waste, plant residues. It can be atmospheric deposition through rain, or fertilizer runoff from agricultural farms. So if we look at the Mississippi watershed, what we actually see is that there's so much agriculture in the Midwest of the U.S., and so much of that all drains into the Mississippi River that when it drains all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, just off of New Orleans, we end up with a dead zone, a major dead zone in an ocean. and that dead zone grows every year. Here's an example of the bottom dissolved oxygen content back in 2008. Here's other articles talking about marine dead zones, and what you can see is that there are a lot of serious dead zones all over the world, but they tend to be centered around areas that have high populations and that are doing a lot of agriculture to support those populations. So it can be nutrients that are coming in through wastewater or nutrients that are coming in through agricultural or livestock. Typically are the main three types of components that add nutrients into these systems, creating these eutrophication and dead zone components. All right, well, thanks for listening this week, and that is our lecture on water pollution.